Let's set up a camera for our character. We're going to be talking about both the camera 2D node and the remote transform node in this lecture. Now, one thing we can do to set a camera is we'll click on this right here to open up our player. We'll attach a camera 2D node to our player. And when we do that, you can see it puts a little box around him to represent the camera. We actually want this to come up a bit. So let's offset the camera. Well, let's actually move the camera's position for this. We'll come up by 8. That puts us about the center of our little character here. And we'll want to turn off drag margin. The drag margin just makes it so that the camera won't move unless your player gets to the edge of whatever the drag margin is. We want the camera to follow the player exactly. And we'll save and run the game. And our camera doesn't work. Why doesn't our camera work? Well, I did that on purpose. The reason the camera doesn't work is because we haven't made this camera current. And it's actually pretty easy to forget to do that. So I wanted to show you guys that. There we go. Now our camera follows the player around. It follows the player 1-to-1, which can look a bit odd sometimes. But there's built-in smoothing here, so we can enable smoothing. The speed is how quickly it smooths towards you. And this will give us a little bit of a delay on our camera. So you can see when the character lands, the camera still moves down a bit. And now what's the problem with this? Well, number one, you've attached your camera to your player, so you can't set the camera to target anything else. And potentially that could be a problem, or potentially not, depending on the game you're making. But the biggest problem is, I'm going to add a little bit of code here. If input dot is, you don't have to do this, by the way. If input dot is action just pressed UI except queue free. So this will make it so if I press the return key, my character will be destroyed. And you can see if I do that, it destroys the camera as well, resetting back to the default camera. And that just looks really weird because we want our camera to remember where it was before the player died. So what are we going to do about this? Well, let's take our camera here and delete it. And let's put this camera in the world. So let's put a camera here in our world. There we go. And we'll set it to current, and we'll turn off the drag margin, and we'll turn on smoothing. But now the camera's not following our player. And we could set up a code to make it follow the player. That's one option. But that's extra code that we'd have to write, and there's a way to do it in Godot without writing any code. So we'll come into our player again. And this time, instead of adding a camera, we'll add what's called a remote transform. The remote transform node gets a remote path, which is just a path to a node that you want it to move. And it will move that node to the position of this node. And you can see it's at the bottom here, so we'll want to actually move it up by 8, just like we did our camera, so it centers on our character. Once we've done that, you can tell it what you want it to update. We do not need to update rotation or scale, so we can turn those off. We'll just update our position. And we want to use global coordinates as well. So we'll save, and we'll actually rename this camera follow like this, and come into our into this world. And we can't see it in our player, but if we right click and do editable children, we can then see the children of the player, select the camera follow, choose a remote path to assign, and select the camera. And I'm just going to call it camera. We don't need to call it camera 2D. Oh, and our path got changed, so we'll update that again. There we go. And you can see the camera before we even run the game, it already is now following the remote transform. So if we move our player around in the world, the camera, let's see, player, the camera will also follow. So the remote transform works in here. And there's a lot of places where you can use remote transform. Now, if I'm running around in the world and my character gets destroyed, the camera doesn't get destroyed. You can see it still smoothly move towards the point that the player was last at, and even after it's been destroyed, and looks quite nice now. So let's get rid of that code that destroys our player, because we don't need it right now. But now we have a working camera in our game. And that's going to be it for this lecture. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all in the next one.